Good afternoon, everybody. So let us now delve into right away into the topic for the day. We're scheduled to finalize our discussion of this chapter 2 in our book, dealing primarily with international trade and the changes in how theory and practice of free trade has evolved over time. It deals primarily with the developments in the later part of the 20th century. With the changes in the trade regime after the Second World War and in the most recent period, and it discusses to some degree some aspects of globalization in modern times. And there is an echo of contemporary debates, political debates in this country and other countries pertaining to problems such as outsourcing. I'll just list a couple of them. Stagnating wages, technological change, what else? What other important concepts you can find in this chapter? Is there anything else that caught your attention about reading this short excerpt? The book was written in 2006. Baklau was, in a sense, ahead of the curve, because many of these issues were not so prominently featuring in the discussions at that time, but nowadays they certainly are. Technological change, automation, machines.
Communication.
Yeah, so that kind of also the changes in communication. One of the motives, one of the important aspects of his discussions of this most recent wave of globalization is the influence of reduced communication costs on globalization. So he mentions internet in the context of communication costs. So it's much easier to utilize the labor force across the national borders insofar as a certain amount of jobs could be performed online. And this is probably much intensified since 2006 when the book was published. Communication cost reductions as incentives for facilitators of globalization. Another concept that mentions towards the end, which kind of follows indirectly from the previous ones, is the compensation for the losses. It's the idea, I think, at least in my case, it was the first encounter with these types of theories with Professor Joseph Stiglitz, American economist, the compensation policy for losses due to globalization. Any ideas? What is that? What are the arguments for or against that? So what are the main sources of problems or costs of globalization? What is the usual argument? before we start thinking about how to compensate the victims. Who are the victims of globalization? In the conventional view, at least.
Is it usually like the more wealthy individuals?
As victims of globalization. Why would wealthy individuals be victims of globalization?
Because maybe more firms are popping up that deal in their area.
Yeah, we can rephrase that. The competition is the competition. The global competition makes lives more miserable to entrepreneurs because they have stronger competition. Yeah, that's correct, but the same applies to work. Now, an American worker producing steel competes against the Chinese worker producing steel. And one of the crucial arguments against globalization is that it undermines, it's exactly contrary to your thesis. It says it's a transfer of wealth from workers to capitalists. How does it work? Because capitalists can invest whenever they want. Free capital markets in the world. China is opening up, India is opening up, new markets are opened where you have a good, relatively educated workforce that will work for less than in America. So you move your money out of the country, that's called outsourcing. See how everything is connected. And you invest abroad, creating unemployment here or reducing the wages, what American workers can do in order to compete against the new supply of Indian labor to reduce the wages they ask. They can say that globalization is a mechanism of redistribution of income from workers to capitalists. What else? Is there anything else that pops up in your mind just by looking at this list and thinking about what you read? Is there any further motive or argument that you found interesting?
I guess just how like the U.S. still kind of like is afraid of moving to like true
Free trade,
while other countries are starting to.
and some American, let's say, protectionism to some degree. There is one particular thing that Deepak Lal is very angry about. Have you noticed that? When it comes to America, that's the world. Talks about the WTO. He doesn't like the WTO. WTO has agreements, two-tier framework for regulating international trade. The first is the agreement on liberalizing goods and services. And the second one is something called TRIPS. TRIPS is an acronym of the Trade Agreement on Intellectual Property Rights. That's TRIPS deals with patents. Intellectual property rights, patents, trademarks, stuff like that. What is his argument against this? Why he likes this but doesn't like that? What kind of redistribution is that? Who gains the most by this? How patents work?
First,
There, go ahead. Yeah, they're essentially monopolistic privileges that some selected companies, the patent holders, get. So they essentially get an increased income over a certain period of time by being the only entities that can sell a certain type of medicine or some type of agricultural product, seeds for this and that, which increases the costs in the third world and increases the incomes of wealthy corporations in the West. So the idea here is that intellectual property rights are unjust redistribution of income from poorer countries to wealthier countries. And he mentions at one point that many of the medical and agricultural patents are based on the local knowledge and local traditions of the poorer countries. What is the argument for patents for intellectual property rights that proponents of this? You see, that's one of the main. What is one of the main disputes between the United States and China is actually that they are not honoring the American intellectual property rights. That they are creating the same generic products illegally, although they're members of the WTO. They're pirating American patented products. Reduces the revenue of American firms that create them. So what are the arguments for patents? People who are supporters that say you don't understand. You cannot have a successful economic system without patents. Or you can have far less successful system without it. To understand this, you have first to realize what is the argumentation for patents.
He kind of says here the incentives for individuals to invest their time and energy into activity.
Yeah, most patents pertain to industrial designs, most intellectual private property rights, insofar as they're relevant for production and investment, are related to those patents and designs. They require an extraordinarily high amount of investment, research and development, and other things. Huge amount of capital to be paid upfront without a guarantee of success. For example, the medicine of coronavirus treatments, coronavirus medications that are floating around. So it won't be easy to convince anyone to invest billions of dollars if you don't give them certain in advance agreed upon compensation for that in the form of having 5 or 8 or 10 years the ability to sell at higher prices to recover the costs of their investment. So you can abolish patents, so the argument goes, but then you would reduce the incentives for people to innovate and to create new drugs, to create new industrial products and designs, and we would have been all worse off without such kind of incentives. So Deepak Lal doesn't. So what he says about this argument, does he comment on it? That will be page 687. Yeah. He says, okay, maybe patents, but what about books, music, and films? Would this creative activity fall below some socially desirable level in the absence of the monopoly provided by copyright? There were no patents when Pythagoras discovered the theorem of Newton and his law of gravity. This did not prevent them from investing the necessary time and resources to make their discoveries. This is because much of basic science is motivated purely by the inquisitive Greek spirit and the lure of fame. To the extent that basic science today requires expensive overhead investment in laboratories and the like, and is public good, it is usually funded by universities who put the fruits of their research in the public domain. So see here refuses the idea of intellectual property rights in the fields of pure science and also entertainment, arts, and so on. So he says, the poor countries have a right to complain that unlike the mutually beneficial tariff reductions, the TRIPS agreement merely transfers income from them to developed country producers. Then the estimates of how much money these countries will lose. Yes, so you see, tariff reductions were under the regime pertaining to goods and services that began with this general agreement of tariff and trade. And after the Uruguay round of negotiations in 1995, I believe the GATT was renamed WTO. And many more countries were admitted, Eastern European countries, some Asian countries as well, eventually Russia and even China. It became a global. So GATT was originally a trade agreement of NATO countries plus Japan. NATO, some European Union countries plus Japan. Now it's a global organization, and every country that in South wants to join. And he says WTO is good as long as it followed in the footsteps of GATT in reducing tariffs and other limitations for it. It's very bad because it insists on these TRIPS. Property rights. There's one irony here, that nowadays the rising powers benefit from international trade and from the lax status of patents and intellectual property rights, whereas the established and wealthy countries lose. So the United States is the main intellectual property rights holder in the world today, and China is the main culprit in disregarding property rights. But in the 19th century, it was the other way around. Actually, the American industry and American economy in the 19th century was based on stealing intellectual property rights from the British. So I have one funny report written by Alexander Hamilton. So you know who Alexander Hamilton was, the first Secretary of Treasury in George Washington's administration. He created kind of task force of industrial spies in America to acquire British trade secrets more efficiently in order to build much more quickly American domestic industries. So any hope that the Chinese would forego whatever the type of regime is in Beijing, as long as they want to develop very quickly, they're going to disregard the intellectual property rights that Americans hold, in the same way America did in the 19th century. There is a certain note of hypocrisy here that, to some degree, at least American business model was based on, or at least consistent with, stealing IPRs from the Great Britain, whereas now America is at the forefront of fighting the IP piracy and smuggling and so on. Okay, another important motive here is stagnating wages and increased unemployment. Status of workers in the Western world. So the main, or at least one of the main arguments for outsourcing is the mechanism that I just mentioned before, that foreign workers compete against the American workers. And then wages in America would decline. Also, there is this theory that discussed a few weeks ago, that when the extent of free trade is increased, a country that a factor of production or a resource in a given country which is relatively less economically important or scarcer will suffer disproportionately from opening up of the industry. So in American case, that's labor. So then the idea is that in opening up the economy, the industry will benefit, capitalists will benefit in America, whereas the labor will suffer. And this will be reflected in relatively low or stagnating or insufficiently increasing wages. I'm not sure that I can agree actually with what he says. That would be one of my criticisms here. He says, since 1980s onwards, there is a real wage stagnation in America. That's a very widespread claim that you can hear from many quarters. And I'm not sure that that fully applies in the case of America. Because when you look, one reason to be skeptical about this, and a lot in his book hinges on this particular empirical claim being correct, and I'm not sure that it's correct. One of the reasons why I doubt its correctness is that when you look at the share of labor income, so it's all labor income, including wages and non-wage benefits, in America is relatively stable, 55 to 60% of GDP in the United States. So it never went below 55, never went upwards to 60. It didn't change very much. When you compare distribution of GDP, so I'll remind you that one of the ways to calculate GDP is to tally up the sources of income, interest plus profit plus rent plus wages and non-wage benefits, labor income. And over time, those calculations show that when those types of incomes from ownership, rent, interest and profit, and labor incomes are essentially that there is a constant proportion. It doesn't change very much. It fluctuates a bit up and down, but it doesn't. You have the idea of a growing economy. American economy is indeed growing at a decent pace in long term. How can then you reconcile the concept of stagnating wage and increasing incomes from ownership with the idea of constant proportion between them? If there is a relatively constant proportion between them, then either the incomes from ownership should be stagnant as well, or income from wages would be increasing at a relatively similar pace as the incomes from ownership, interest, wages, and rent. So now what's going on? These two things cannot be correct in the same time. Please. Have any explanation for what might be going on here? The most plausible explanation that I have for this is that the structure of labor income have changed. The structure of workers' compensation, typical worker compensation, have changed over time. For a variety of reasons having to do with our regulatory and tax system, there are great incentives for employers and employees to move a larger portion of labor income from wages to other kinds of fringe benefits that are paid but that are not reflected in wages. Healthcare, savings for 1K, so many other kinds of benefits that are paid as a part of labor income, but that are not reflected in wages. For a variety of reasons, the share of these non-fringe benefits in total workers' compensation increased over time. So that, yeah, the wages might be growing relatively slow, but the non-wage income fringe benefits are increasing by a much higher rate. So then when you add up wages plus non-wage benefits, you get actually this higher curve. So this is just one quirk of the American system in which you have to pay a large part of labor income in non-wage benefits. To some degree, it's a change in preferences that workers themselves like to do it. To some degree, it's a consequence of the laws and regulations. But the total wage income, but the total labor income remain pretty much at a similar, increasing at a similar pace as incomes from ownership, interests, profits, and rents. So there is no, it's difficult to talk about any kind of class struggle or class injustice in this society in which people on wages would be exploited by owners, workers, capitalists. So then on the other hand, that's too much into the weeds here, but just one more point I wanted to mention here. There is a difference between functional distribution and personal distribution of income. So what is a personal distribution of income? You take 6 of us and then see who is earning the most per month. Tally up our incomes and then see what is the income and then distributing shares. I earn 35%, you earn 19%, you earn, and so on down the line. So that's personal distribution. But what is functional distribution? Functional distribution is a distribution to the different functions of the economy. So what is interest? Interest is an income rewarding saving. Profit rewards risk taking. Rents reward providing goods and services, renting goods and services to other people who work with them. Wages compensate for the services of labor. Individual income is a kind of composite of different shares of different types of income. So pretty much every worker is in the same time wage earner and has also interest income if you invest. And if you are 401k, you receive interest, or if you have money in a bank, you receive some amount of interest income. If you're the owner of a firm, you have profit or not. Or rent, if you rent anything to anyone, you have an apartment to rent, you receive a certain rental. So that any individual income is typically a composite of different functions, or different functional compensations for different activities that people perform. So I work for wage, but I at the same time have money in a bank and I own the apartment. So I receive the 3 different types of income. So what is my personal income is composite of 3 different types. So it's misleading to talk about capitalists and workers as 2 discrete separate groups. They just, all of us, most of us are in the same time both capitalists and rentiers and workers to a different degree. Okay, so that's a side note to this. So stagnating wages. Now, there are far-reaching implications of this theory. So if wages are stagnating and outsourcing is the major reason for that, then what is the policy? What are the policy solutions for that? What can we do to solve the problem, to eliminate the negative effects of outsourcing? It's very popular. It seems now that the Republicans and Democrats in this country pretty much agree about this. It used to be that the Republicans didn't agree, but after Donald Trump, now there's not much difference. So, helping our workers, what is the proposal? What is the idea? Yeah, tariffs, trade protection. Increase our wages by increasing the profit of our domestic firms, by forcing domestic firms. Remember when Donald Trump said last year, if you move a factory from Michigan to Mexico, I'm gonna impose a tax, whatever, 20-30%. So that's a policy. That's a policy that was popular in South America and in some Eastern European and African countries, this idea of protectionism. That's called industrial policy. This idea of using governmental power to prevent moving of our factories abroad and our industrial interests across the borders. Is there a policy, a much milder policy? This one used to be Bill Clinton's policy, when the Democrats were much more free market friendly. Now they are pretty much on the same page with Donald Trump and nationalist Republicans. There's compensation policy, which says, no, we know that we shouldn't be strangling competition. Competition is a good thing. It's creative destruction, as Joseph Schumpeter said. But we cannot deny that it creates winners and losers. So then let's tax winners a little bit in order to create the funds to compensate the losers, people who lose their jobs, to provide for their ability to re-educate or retrain and to start working in other jobs. Lal says that the value of this first argument, that outsourcing creates problems on the American labor market, is overstated. That the far more important is this factor of automation and technological change. Especially in one respect, low-skilled labor. That's the idea. We're going to bring back jobs to America from Chinese. We used to produce whatever, plastic or glass or clothing. Now we're not making it anymore. Chinese are making it. They're killing us. We have to bring back our low-skilled, medium-skilled, good-paying jobs back. Now, the claim which I think is correct is that the role of outsourcing in killing the low-skilled jobs in America, a large part of industrial low-skilled or medium-skilled jobs, killing this for this the role of technology is more important than outsourcing. The substitution of human labor with technology and machinery is an accelerating pace. And then the argument is we shouldn't be resisting this. By the way, one illustration of this, just one subtle point here. How many times have you heard that American manufacturing is in decline? Chinese are killing us and so on. Take a look at the figures how much American industrial manufacturing produces in the last 20 years. Manufacturing production is increasing by leaps and bounds, faster than the GDP. So that's a myth. American manufacturing is not in decline, producing much more cars, much more of everything. But the trick is that we're using far fewer people to produce that. Why? Because we're using better technology, equipment, and production processes. And people who used to work in a car factory just doing some manual work, now are not needed. Now they're moving where people are moving away from manufacturing. Far fewer people work in manufacturing. We're moving in a post-industrial society. So what are the main occupations that are very high demand? A similar level of skills required as in manufacturing. Yeah, services industries, healthcare. These are some of the main areas. So you have this relocation of labor from low-skilled and relatively lower-paid jobs in manufacturing into services. And the idea here is, of course, that we shouldn't be trying to stop this process. We should help with the governmental policies, people to deal with the consequences of change rather than to arrest change itself. What do you think? Any thoughts about this? Trade, protectionism, technological change.
I kind of agree that like protectionism like hinders growth.
What would be the best argument that we can make for protectionism, even if you don't agree?
That prevents people from losing their job.
Yeah, it could be one. It could be like a national interest argument. That's also plausible. So Trump administration used that argument when they imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum. So you have even in WTO rules actually that you can introduce protectionist measures in the cases of protecting your national interests. Some commodity is of military use, so you may restrict exports of that. That's possible. Or if certain branch of industries of national interest for military use or others, you can then prohibit importation of that good and so on. Some of these arguments could be made. I'm not so certain about protecting domestic jobs to what degree that could be sustained when you think about it more completely. Because what would have happened if you adopt that policy protecting domestic jobs? So you see, jobs are not valuing in and of themselves. So production of goods and services is the economic value, and jobs are the expenditure that we have to pay for consumer goods and services. So by saying that we should be protecting some jobs that could not sustain the competition of the world economy means actually that we should be propping up the production processes that are not as efficient as something else in producing. So there is always this conflict between the interest of producers and consumers in every society. So that's one of the main fault lines. The whole discussion of trade liberalization, globalization. Consumer sovereignty and producer interest. Tariffs, with anything else. Consumer sovereignty. Of course, consumer sovereignty shouldn't be taken in a literal sense that we are all slaves of consumers, but in a metaphorical sense, of course. Consumer preferences should be dictating what is going to be produced, how and how much, not the ideas of somebody in the government or economists, what is a just or fair way to produce something, having in mind some distributional, desired distributional effect. So you see how there is a strange parallel between nationalism and socialism. Nationalism in the economic sense, as industrial policy and national planning and so on, that both of them are the distributivist doctrines. That they start from the assumption that there is some given and just distribution of income, and what we should do as a government, that's the question, to effectuate this distribution. So what is the socialist distribution of income? Distributivism. Equal shares or certain level of inequality. They're always obsessing about relative equality and inequality of different social groups. But always there is a victim. There is somebody who needs to be helped, lifted, and there is always somebody who is the culprit of that problem. So you have the same in this nationalist protectionist narrative. Domestic workers are always the victim, and foreign aggressors, foreign economic aggressors are the reason. Japanese and so on. So it's so funny. Now, if you were very young actually, and you probably heard if you follow that at all about protectionism as something that became pertinent in our politics like 4 or 5 years ago. And you would think that the right wing in this country, the president and some people in the Republican Party are the main purveyors of this ideology. So remember, it was actually the other way around. The first demonstrations against free trade, against globalization, large demonstrations, happened in 1999 in Seattle. So you had not been born at that time. Bill Clinton was the president, and they were negotiating about the WTO and the expansion of free trade and so on. And the demonstrators were primarily trade unions and radical anarchists, like the equivalents of today's Antifa in the United States. These were the people who were fighting against globalization in 1999. The Republican Party were the strongest champions of free trade. In 1994, Newt Gingrich, you know who Newt Gingrich is? He's an old statesman, American statesman, conservative Republican. He negotiated, he pushed Bill Clinton to negotiate NAFTA with Canada and Mexico. And the Congress, led by Newt Gingrich, ratified and supported, they voted for NAFTA. And then fast forward, about 2007, 2008, the Democrats started flirting with protectionism. There was a primary campaign, Obama versus Hillary Clinton, and both of them just lambasted John McCain was the Republican nominee for his free trade, letting down the American workers but allowing Chinese. And the entire story that Donald Trump will take over in 2016. See how these things fluctuate and travel between different political poles. So there is a certain staying power in these ideas. They're not ideological. They're not left wing or right wing. Actually, they are very, very generic ideas that sometimes pop up ideologically on the right, sometimes on the left, but they're here nevertheless. This idea of a certain pattern of income distribution is good and given, and we should use the government force to effectuate that type of distribution. So then maybe another side note here. If you look, so our concepts of left and right are usually like you have Joe Biden here and Donald Trump here. Donald Trump is on the right, Joe Biden is on the left. What are their what are their differences? How would you describe them? Why do you think, or do you consider Donald Trump to be right-wing and Joe Biden to be left-wing? What are the main reasons why people classify them as such?
Tax rates.
Yeah, that would be one. So Donald Trump is for low taxes, Joe Biden is for higher taxes and government spending in general. I mean, that Trump was particularly successful in implementing this agenda, partially, but okay, that's in general the difference. What else?
Social ideas.
Social ideas, yeah, exactly. So you see how much of our concepts of left and right are not determined by different economic philosophies and different concepts of the relationship between the individual and the government, but rather by issues like what is it? What was the biggest fight of the Trump administration 2016, 2020? Biggest political fights were over judges. Why over judges? What was at stake? Now, Amy Coney Barrett was appointed Supreme Court. What was the main fault line? The Democrats were lambasting her for days. They were just asking abortion, gay marriage, those kinds of issues. That's the main dividing line. The right wing is against abortion, against gay marriage, against that. The left wing is for all of these things. And the level of intolerance and friction here is increasing. 20 years ago, there were no major differences about it. Immigration, another issue. The right wing is an anti-immigrant, restrictionist view. We don't need so much immigration. Let's stop. Left wing, open borders. literally open borders. Let's increase. Diversity is a value in and of itself. 20 years ago, that was not the case. No. There's the polarization on those social issues increased by leaps and bounds. While there was a convergence in this field here, economic. When you compare Ronald Reagan in 1981, his rhetoric, his values, with the left-wing politician, democratic politician, there's not much difference in their view of abortion or immigration and so on. Yeah, there was, but that was not the issue. Tax rates, spending, foreign policy, these were the main problems. Now it's the other way around. So an alternative way of looking at this would be to say, yeah, in many respects, both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are politically on the left because both of them want to use the government in different and sometimes in very similar ways to change the market outcomes if they don't like the results of market competition. And here would be somebody who I could, maybe the closest approximation of a politician exemplifying those economically right-wing ideas would be our neighbors, Governor Kristi Noem in South Dakota. Who's very strict and very radical in her free market, individual liberty agenda. Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, these would be the kind of people who exemplify economic right wing. So see how the concepts of left and right in terms of social divisions does not coincide with the economical right wing. So this then helps explain to some degree why we have some sort of strange bedfellows. You see that there is Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump that had their ideas are sometimes very difficult to differentiate. Their ideas about immigration and trade are just like a mirror image of one another. And why, on the other hand, you had in England, Tony Blair was relatively similar to Margaret Thatcher. Tony Blair is a left-wing politician, but nevertheless he said, no, we cannot go back to nationalization and heavy-handed control of the economy. What Ms. Thatcher did was correct, in privatizing the economy and opening it. And then what she said, when Tony Blair, the guy who leads the opposition party, was elected, she said, Britain will be safe in the hands of Mr. Blair. So we should be careful with those left-wing, right-wing distinctions. And this economic analysis here shows us an illustration of this, that both mistakes and correct theories are promulgated by people from different ends of the political spectrum. That some of the most popular ideas are ubiquitous. Okay, is there anything else worth discussing? Any comments? Elections happened. We don't know the final results, but whatever they are, what do you think? Maybe we can close with that. What would be the consequences for economic policies if Joe Biden wins, as it now seems increasingly likely he will? What will change as compared to Donald Trump's administration? One thing that will not change, most likely, if you follow the debates, is that he's not much more likely to engage in any foreign free trade agreements anymore. So remember this TRIP agreement with that Obama administration made in 2016. That was a free trade agreement between the United States, Mexico, Canada, Peru, Chile, and South American countries, then New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, many other countries in the Pacific Rim. And it was designed to counter the influence of China, to isolate China economically, politically. diplomatically, to tie the countries of the Pacific Rim to the United States. It will be kind of new powerful trade alliance led by America. I have mentioned this to you as an illustration of how surprising, not so much surprising for me, this was. Joe Biden participated in passing this agreement. The first act on day one in office, Donald Trump canceled that agreement. Now, you would think that Joe Biden would say, in day one in my office, I will revive this agreement, because that's what Obama and I did, and I believe that's a good thing. Free trade under the American umbrella with our friends is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Oh, no. He says, no, that was a mistake. I don't want to go back to that. I want to protect the American worker by some like a watered down version of Donald Trump's protectionist trade policy. You see the flip in 1990s, it was the Reagan-Gingrich free trade policy that pushed the Democrats to accept free trade. Now it's Republican, I don't know, it was probably some Republican criticism, but also Bernie Sanders. You should bear in mind that the Democrats have this very powerful populist wing in their own party, economically populist wing, led by Elizabeth Warren and especially Bernie Sanders. It agrees with that. So then if they're against protectionism, people like Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton would be accused of being like the shills for big business and who don't care about American workers and so on. Okay. So, what do you think? Otherwise, apart from trade, do you expect any positive or negative change, independently where you stand politically? It doesn't matter. Okay. So, what was the domestic record of Trump administration when it comes to economics? We're not going to discuss other issues. Economically, what were the main initiatives, main things that Trump administration did in economics? Tax cuts. Okay. What else?
Some business regulation.
Yeah, the reducing, in some cases, dramatically business regulations. So that's one of the areas to look for, to see what the potential Biden administration could do. What would you expect it to do, based on your analysis or your watching television, following, I assume, politics to some degree?
So, replace those restrictions. I know he wants to shift towards like businesses focusing on like green energy now.
Green energy.
How that will.
So although he did not technically accept this radical Green New Deal plan, but even his own plan is a kind of watered down version of that. So it remains to be seen. The Republicans also in the past had all kinds of lists of good wishes what they want to achieve, but that's one thing, and another thing is what you can achieve in reality. So now one of the crucial issues is also, okay, if Biden is the president, now the key problem is who holds the Senate. So one thing in terms of economic reforms that you, insofar as they depend on passing legislatures, and in the case of Democrats, that usually means passing legislation. Public option, that would be public option in healthcare, Biden's promise. It will require a legislative change in the Senate. With Mitch McConnell as majority leader in the Senate, you can forget about it. Even I read this morning an article in Axios that says that Biden people are already, even before he's officially proclaimed the winner, the election, they start thinking about how to placate Mitch McConnell, that Joe Biden will probably promote like a centrist and more moderate, less radical members of the cabinet because they are afraid that the Senate under Mitch McConnell would not confirm some more controversial persons. Stacey Abrams of Georgia or Susan Rice, who were seen as candidates for cabinet posts, are going to be. So this dynamic is also political economy is something to watch. If the Democrats have the majority in the Senate, which is not quite yet excluded, but it's unlikely. But possible theoretically still. Then that's one situation. Last time they had that was under Obama, first 2 years of first Obama administration, when Obamacare was passed. They had not only, they had filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. You know what's that? 60 senators. So you can vote to break the filibuster, so you essentially can enact whatever you want. You have majority in the House of Representatives, they're going to retain that, although they lost a couple of people in the House. So filibuster-proof majority, that's how Obamacare was passed. With 0 Republican votes. So that's also, that will determine to what degree these more radical plans, like some version of Green New Deal or public option in healthcare, how likely they are. If Mitch McConnell is a majority leader, I think that you can forget about it for a time being, at least for 2 years. Nothing significant will change, which may not be the worst possible thing in the world, because our founding fathers believe that divided government is a good thing. It's the system of checks and balances, maybe. It should be that way, that one side can get away with whatever they want. That's depending. Now this is problematic insofar as if you think that the agenda that the Biden administration will want to pursue is a good thing, that you don't like the checks and balances, but the same apply to Republicans as well. When they were in the majority, but with some checks on the side of the Democrats. Okay, so watch for that. Maybe next time we will know formally who is the president. They say that today they're finish counting votes. And then you'll see there are some things that will never change, actually. And that's also a good thing. But I think that we can expect some, not so much in foreign. Okay, foreign policy is not our concern, but foreign economic policy, trade policy, don't expect too much change there. In domestic policy, maybe larger changes. Okay, then let's call it today. If you don't have any further questions. And I will post a reminder for you to think about the papers. What was the next Thursday? You should submit me the title and the basic thesis of your paper, final paper. So I will send you a reminder on Canvas about that. And I'll see you then. See you next Tuesday.